This is always a highlight of the year for us. We're very excited that we were able to hold this event now for 10 years in a row. Now that tells you how you age quickly here, but it is remarkable that we were able to do this. And today we're going to celebrate, of course, this 10th anniversary by centering and focusing on Elaine Pinderhughes' newest book with the two co-authors, co-editors of the book, and Ruth will talk more about that in a second. But as this is the diversity and justice event of the year for us, I was just, as you read news on a daily basis, you listen to the radio, and there are just a few things that I want to mention at the very beginning before I go and talk a little bit more about the event. Yesterday there was a publication you may have read of a new study on the correlation or connection between wealth and longevity. And the title was "The Rich Live Longer Everywhere, for the Poor, Geography Matters." And the interesting thing is, well, one of the stunning findings was that the richest American live 15 years longer than the poorest 1%. And some of the life expectancy of the poorest is as low as some of the sub-Saharan African countries' life expectancy, and Rwanda was mentioned as one of the examples. Now, the fact that geography matters is also interesting because when you look where the poor live the longest, it is in the cities. And it is in the cities because, as Thomas Frieden says, the director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, that's where the poor have the widest access to social, educational, and economic opportunity. When you look at the top 10 of the cities, New York is top, where men have a life expectancy among the poor of almost 80 years old. Boston is in those top 10, the number 10 with 78 years. Women live longer, and the life expectancy where the poor live the longest is actually Miami, with 84 years old. And Boston doesn't make the top 10. Now, where do the poor live the shortest is interesting. So it's not the big cities, except for Detroit and Indianapolis, which are number 2 and number 3, but it's the Rust Belt. It's the cities in Oklahoma, Kentucky, Tennessee, where men have a life expectancy of 74 years old. And then for women, it's similar, except the top shortest is Las Vegas, where the poorest women live 80 years old. So there's a huge discrepancy between, but geography matters in these kinds of circumstances. Now, when you think about the poor, you of course, in our minds, and when you listen to the politicians these days, it's sometimes very sobering how little they know, but they sometimes associate the poor immediately with African American and blacks. That's the poor, or maybe the Latinos. But when you look at the statistics, that may have been truer in the late 60s, where 55%, but the poverty rate among blacks was 55%. Now in 2012, it's still high. It's much higher than the whites, but it's down to 27%. It's a big shift in the last 50 years of the percentage that is gathered here by different researchers. Hispanics are right behind them. They are 25%, and Asian 15%, and white and non-Hispanic white around 10%. So there's a big difference, but there's still you got to see these differences in how this has shifted over the years, because it tells you about the connections and interrelation between poverty, geography, and race. And this is, I think, what we have done in many years, and when our Diversity and Justice Committee has every year focused on one area, and the last 2 years on race, we were always aware of the intersectionality of issues and of dimensions. And so potentially, I talked with Ruth McCroy about this, potentially we will next year consider intersectionality a topic of focus, because you focus on one thing and then you leave the other out and people feel that there is something missing. But this event is an event where we gather, especially also we try to see as many students as possible. Sometimes it's difficult on a Wednesday because they're in field. And then we do reiterate some of the content for the students, and we also tape it so the students have a chance to read it. But the goal of the event is in a way twofold. One, we really want to celebrate the life and accomplishments of our distinguished Professor Elaine Pinderhughes, one of a kind, I would say. She has been with us for many years at the school, left a major mark, and when I came, she decided that's time for her to leave. Now, it was good that she was still oftentimes at my door, and we plotted how we're going to make this a much more diverse and more just School of Social Work, and I'm just delighted that during all my 15 years, she has been with us, and hopefully for many years to come. But we also celebrate through the Pinderhughes lecture the commitment of our school to issues of diversity, equity, and justice. And I think the school has done has had remarkable progress in this area. We have a number of centers who have a focus on this, and they have the newest center, which is co-led by Ruth McCroy, David Takuchi, and Tiziana Deering, has a focus on economic, environmental, and social equity. So a lot of things will come out from that as well. So I will ask now, and many of the things that of course is done are done by faculty, staff, and students, so our Diversity and Justice Committee is instrumental in moving these goals forward. And so we were very lucky over the first 8 to 10 years to rely on Paul Klein, our professor of clinical practice, to lead this challenging and very rewarding committee. And then when Paul thought we heard his song too many times, that's a quote, he asked, can we assign someone else? And of course, Ruth was the most natural choice. And so Ruth McCroy, our endowed professor, focused on child welfare and adoption, took it on. And since then, Ruth has been an unbelievable leader in this area. So may I ask Ruth to come forward?
Good morning. It's wonderful to have all of you here, and thank you so much, Alberto, for that introduction. It's hard to believe that this is the 10th anniversary of the Pinderhughes Lecture. This is amazing. Let's join me in giving Elaine a hand for this. As Alberto mentioned, we've had a focus on a variety of different topics over the past 10 years. We've looked at issues such as same-sex marriage, importance of culture, the treatment of African American clients and families. We looked at issues of immigration, refugees, poverty, depression, recession, social justice, persons with disabilities, a variety of different aspects of diversity. We've had many different speakers, including the law school dean, Vincent Rago. We've had Jack Kirkland, the George Warren Brown School of Social Work. We've had Nancy Boyd Franklin, Monica McGoldrick. And last year, many of you may have been here, and we heard an amazing lecture, and also serenade by the dean of the dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Connecticut. Maybe Alberto will sing this year. For this 10th year anniversary, we are honored to be able to have at the table with us to speak Elaine Pinderhughes and her co-authors, Vanessa Jackson and Patricia Romney. We are also very excited to have as a respondent to the presentation today, Martin Romney, also from BC. I'm sorry, I said Romney. Where did I get that from? Summers, of course. Don't want to bring up, okay. All of you are familiar with Elaine. She has extensive experience in both teaching and writing and clinical practice and conducting diversity training. She's the author of a book that we have back there that's called Understanding Race, Ethnicity, and Power, The Key to Efficacy in Clinical Practice. She also co-authored the book, The Power to Care, Clinical Practice Effectiveness with Overwhelmed Clients. She's received many awards throughout her career, including the 2012 CSWE Lifetime Achievement Award. She was responsible for establishing this diversity series, and we're so excited and honored to have her found this event, and most importantly today, to present at our 10th diversity lecture. Her co-presenters include Vanessa Jackson, who has a master's degree from Washington University, George Warren Brown School of Social Work. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's the owner of Healing Circles, which is a healing-based practice in Atlanta, Georgia. She's the author of a book called In Our Own Voice, African American Stories of Oppression, Survival, and Recovery in Mental Health Systems. She also wrote Separate and Unequal, The Legacy of Racially Segregated Psychiatric Hospitals, which is focused on the history of African American psychiatric experiences. She's a nationally recognized speaker on a variety of issues. A lot of times she's focused on mental health issues, culturally conscious therapy, therapy with marginalized populations. The co-presenter today is Dr. Patricia Romney, clinical and organizational psychologist who received her PhD from the City University of New York, where she won the Bernard Ackerman Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Graduate Psychology. She completed her psychology internship at the Yale University School of Medicine and has done postgraduate work at the College of Executive Coaching. For 20 years, she taught at the college level, achieving tenure at Hampshire College, and for 10 years, she taught at Mount Holyoke College. She's been a lecturer at Smith College and also a consultant to the Boston University School of Social Work. She's authored over 20 articles and papers on clinical and organizational topics, and she's engaged in a variety of projects focused on diversity initiatives, on leadership development and team building and professional coaching of individual clients. Currently, her work is focused on consulting and coaching for excellence and equity in higher education. Elaine, given all of the work that they've done, as I've just described, the three of them have worked together to complete a new book, a brand new book that's called Understanding Power, 21st Century Human Services Imperative. And there's a flyer on that book in the table in the back. We are really excited that this book will be published very soon by NASW Press and hope that all of you will get a copy of it. We're very fortunate today that they will be able to talk about the book. And the title of their topic today is Power Conversations, the challenge of integrating power analysis into social work education and practice. They build on Elaine's work throughout her career on the focus on power, the novel ways in which power theories are being applied in clinical, training, policy, and research settings, and the possibilities of this for the future of social work. If we can center our work in these areas, I am delighted to introduce to you our speakers for today at the 10th Annual Pinderhughes Lecture, Elaine, Pat, and Vanessa. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning. I want to first thank Dean Gozenzi for setting up. Can you hear? I want to first thank Dean Gozenzi for setting up this series of lectures. It has been a great joy in my life About the book that we want to talk about today, I want to say that it had its inception in a series of phone conversations that Vanessa and I had over several years. But when you are in your 80s and you start thinking about a project like this on a subject like power, which is infinitely difficult to understand and complex, you need to know, don't go there. Because number one, I continued to age and my brain changed. It was amazing how I changed. I did not want to look at this. It was too hard. I didn't want to be bothered. And if it hadn't been for Vanessa and Pat, this book would never, ever have been completed. So we're all grateful that they came on board. I guess I want to talk to you a little about the inception of the book and why power has been such an I've been so obsessed with that topic. I thought I would begin with that because this is the basis of the book. As all of you know, I've written about it, and the book that I wrote, Understanding Race, Ethnicity, and Power, there is a chapter on power in the book, and it is the chapter that is the most requested to be copied. That book has sold over 30,000 copies, and it's now considered a classic. As a result of that, and the interest that people showed in that chapter, I began to wonder about thinking about understanding and writing about the issue of power itself, which, as I said, is a no-no. And I wanted to talk to you myself about why I've been so obsessed with understanding power. And of course, when we try to understand why we do things, we go back to our origins, we go back to our family, we go back to, it originated in my family life as I grew up and in the community that I grew up in. So that's what I want to talk about. I grew up in Washington, D.C. many, many years ago, behind the walls of segregation, in the capital of this great country, the United States of America, where everything was segregated. Everything. The schools, the neighborhoods, the churches, the restaurants, all gathering places. That was what I knew about social life as I grew up. The effect on me, I remember wondering, well, was white really better? Looking over there, it had to be better. Everything told us that it was supposed to be better. And I didn't get a chance to test it until I went to graduate school, because I went to Howard University, which was an African American university. Was never taught that being African American was a good thing to be. It was always, don't shame your race, don't shame your family. But I don't remember. There are other people who were taught that, but I do not remember being taught that. We never mentioned the word racism or oppression. We talked about segregation. We talked about slavery. We were not talking about racism. At the same time, I knew that Dunbar High School, the high school that I went to in Washington, D.C., was an excellent institution. So I began to be immediately in the middle of contradictions about race, because many of the graduates from Dunbar High School went on to the best universities in the country. So I knew oppression and I knew privilege, in a manner of speaking, from community and domination and subordination in my family. So a lot of my thinking about power in relationships came from observing my parents. My father was not the stereotypical black male. He was the original dominator. And my mother cooperated with that. And I remember when she tried to stand up for herself and she'd get into conflicts, I used to get angry at her, not him. Can you believe that? I learned more about power, about exerting my power, as I studied social work, and I became an activist, so much such that in 1943, I ended up in jail in Colorado for picketing against segregation. So I was an early jailbird. Based on picketing against segregation. But my most important lessons about changing subordinate, constraining power came from my professional life. My involvement in efforts to change an inner-city child guidance clinic, the structure and services of which were reinforcing subordination and stuckness in clients, and the clients they were serving, instead of the growth and actualization they really deserved. That was a baptism by fire, and I have written about it. It was an amazing experience to be a part of this agency, because everything that we did and the whole way that it had been set up, this was in the 1960s, was totally reinforcing the subordination of African Americans. And we couldn't see that at that time. But the struggle to change all of that was, as I said, a baptism by fire for me. And I learned then about the fact that when power is changing, people who have power will not give it up easily, and the people who are gaining power get confidence, and it was a wonderful experience. The change required not just management of diversity and power issues within the client-worker relationship, but a complete overhauling of all agency policies and services that supported client empowerment. And it was It was an amazing experience, but it was the source of all that I have written and done since then. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, I'll pick up. Okay, nice. Well, actually, I want to, a couple things. This is going to be a love fest, and this really is a conversation, because I'm just so happy to be here. And as you were talking, Elaine, I just remember, Elaine was my professor at Washington University, and she came to do an intensive. And first of all, at that time, I was 1988. Washington University did, George Warren Brown School of Social Work did not have a full-time African-American woman faculty member. And so, yeah, that was a lot of conversation about that. But, so it was so important for me when you showed up, because I had been told a couple things. One is that I would professionally ghettoize myself, I do believe that was a language, if I studied African-American issues. And for me, it was like, this is a community that brought me here. How could I not take back home what I learned? And then to have you show up was so important, because it showed me the possibility. And I think that's really important, and why we need to have people that look like us in these places, because it told me it was possible. And I think it totally transformed my work. And I would not be who I am without you. And the other piece of it was, I don't know if you remember the phone call that it was intervention approaches with minority families, and I thought I'm second-year graduate student, and I'm just like over this. And I thought, I don't know what this is going to be about, but I need to call this person up now and put them on notice about I'm not going to do like sort of this litany of stereotypes about minority families. And I called you up, and all I remember you saying was it's going to be okay. I don't even know the words, but it was really like, just trust me. It was just like, just trust me. And so that class was the most amazing thing I'd ever experienced, because it was really, there was a theoretical part, and I do remember that. But what I remembered most were the two questions. How have I experienced power, and how have I experienced powerlessness? And I remember literally the moment when I sitting around this long table with maybe 12, it was a small class, maybe 12 or 15 students, and I just put my pen down, and I knew that I was about to be changed. And I think that when you can have an educational experience create that kind of possibility, where I'm going to walk away from here different than I walked in this door. And it was a place of great struggle. One of the things in answering those questions, I tell people to this day, it was literally the first time I ever authentically listened to a white woman's story without really kind of rolling my eyes and getting prepared to talk about how hard it had been for me. And I think part of that was you setting it up with, we're going to share and not compare. And also communicating that everyone was going to have their time to share, which had not always been the case. And so I think there were a number of things about how you created and held space. And I think for me, one of the things we want to talk about and how this book can be used is how you set up that space. Like, I think that for me, and I'm really pleased that NASW Press is publishing the book, and Pat will talk more about that, is because your work is so uniquely about, so it is the heart of social work. And for me to be able to talk about power and to have power analysis, one of the things I've always said is that how many people, when I go out and present, is how many people have worked in empowerment programs? And of course, everyone throws their hands up because we've been doing empowerment programs for the last 50 years. And so my question is, how many of you have ever had specific training on power analysis? And it's 3 people, usually from University of Connecticut School of Social Work, and anyone that's had Elaine's class. And I think that that's a problem, because how in the world have we been doing this work and not having and providing an ongoing opportunity for people to analyze power? We talk about all kind of things. You know, we talk about intersectionality. It's like if you're talking about power, intersectionality is in the room. And so for me to be able to create the spaces in my work with my clients, one of the things, I am a complete and very proud non-academic person. Well, that's been one of our ongoing discussions, is Elaine says, you're going to end up in some kind of, academic program. It's like, let me tell you that, like, as God is my witness, that's not going to happen. But I think there's also the part.
It ain't over till it's
She's hardcore. She's really hardcore. But part of it was about how to bridge, and I think that's in some ways our partnership has been about bridging all these consulting, academia, and activism and clinical conversations. And she'd say, write that down, write that down. And I think it is, the nature of it constantly changes, and just when you think you understand it, you find some new aspect. I think working on this collaboration really changed me, changed my thinking, changed the nature of my practice. I identify my practice as a power-based practice. And one of the things that I do, and actually on your table are little stacks of cards, if you see in the center, and those are power cards, and they actually were cards I put together for my clients and training that I was conducting for the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault for a workshop that I do with them annually on reclaiming power in the aftermath of rape. And I wanted to give people a tool to support power literacy and to do it in such a way that it was like everyday understanding, everyday analysis of power. And so that's one of the things. So I have a bowl of those in my office, and because I am prone to the magical as a soul doula, that's a whole other story, is that I have my clients pull them, and sometimes it's like they're walking out the door. This is a thing that you need to be thinking about for the next week. And so it's really wonderful when I see that people can really grab this. They already know these issues. And one of the things I tell people, if you don't think that we're not always thinking about power, I said try to take 2 toddlers and break a cookie unevenly in front of them, and you'll see the first negotiations of power. Right? So we're always thinking about it, and so for me it's about making it transparent, giving people an understanding of the power lines. I tell people it's like being on Mission Impossible when they drop down into the jewel vault and they have to know where the wires are. I think our work as social workers especially is help people to understand where those power lines are, what the analysis is, something's going on, and then helping people to figure ways out of it. And so one of the things we did was put, and Elaine and Pat worked on this, a syllabus in here, because there's no excuse. There is absolutely no excuse, because you guys have a whole concentration on power analysis right here at Boston College. There's a whole concentration, right? No. Not yet. Not yet, thank you. Because it is so essential, and I think that we gave a tool in our book for people to have no excuse not to center their work in power in a very explicit and direct way. So I'll pass on to you.
Thank you. Well, I have been fortunate to work with these 2 leading social workers over the last couple of years. They've taken me under their wing, despite the fact that as a first-generation college student, I didn't have the wisdom to become a social worker. And it has been really quite a joy. I have been interested in power since the movements of the 1960s, of which I was a member, a part of a group called the Third World Women's Alliance, a group that I'm now writing a book about. And it has remained a central interest in my life. On the light side, I have to say that I just taught my 2-year-old granddaughter to say "power to the people" next time she next time she met her grandpa. So we've been having fun with that. I met Elaine at the American Family Therapy Academy in my first year as a member there, and she lovingly took me under her wing and offered me a lot of guidance and support, and so I've been an admirer of her and her work since that time. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this book that we have put together, and I'll start with the syllabus and say a little bit about that. We were very, very focused on trying to develop a syllabus, a kind of beginning template that social work schools could use to build a curriculum that focused on power. We talk about racism, we talk about sexism, homophobia, etc., and all of those are extremely important. But the underlying issue in many areas of oppression is the issue of power. And so with the guidance of Hae-Kyung Kang, who is the new director of the School of Social Work at the University of Seattle, we really set out this and developed this syllabus on power, which is aligned with all of the goals of social work education as elaborated by CSW. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We also thought very hard and long about the writers and the authors in this manuscript, in this book, and we're very intent on making sure that even though led by 3 black women, edited by 3 black women, and we have some very important pieces in there about black women, one by Lonnie Jones, and there are a couple of authors here. Lonnie is one. Could you raise your hand?
Stand up, stand up.
Stand up, Lonnie. And can I ask the other authors, Kevin Mahoney and Hugo Kamya, to just stand for a minute so people could see you or wave? So we do have some really remarkable pieces about black women in this book. Lonnie's piece is about developing psychosocial competence. Vanessa is writing about turning powerlessness into power, and a very compelling clinical piece by Vanessa McAdams Mahmood, writing about racial shaming and humiliation in psychotherapy. And that really stood out for me when you were talking this morning, Elaine, about the shame that you felt or were educated to feel as an African American in segregated Washington. And so Vanessa McAdams has really taken us into a deep, very directive approach to undercutting and undermining and diffusing racial shaming and humiliation in psychotherapy, and it's an approach that really speaks to anyone from any clinical orientation. So we have that solid heart and core of the book, and of course, Elaine's writing about her own conceptualizations of how power operates. And so that is very important to take a look at. But we went beyond that to really look not only at power in clinical settings, but also power in community settings. There's a wonderful article there about, by Carol Mostow about the work she's been doing in anti-racist education and anti-oppression education with physicians in the Bronx. We also have done some work, have some articles in there about consultation. And I was very, in my work, consulting to mostly now academic leaders, but also to leaders of human service programs, was very intent on writing about position power, how leaders of organizations take power and use their power to and power with others to change, to create socially just, progressive organizations in the interest of those that they serve. So there's some, I hope that that's a very good piece. It writes about Beverly Tatum's work at Spelman College. It writes about Dennis Biscard's work, where he in Connecticut is educating leaders of color to become heads of independent schools throughout the country. So really speaking about how people can use position power. And we have Latino writers, and we have Asian writers, and Vanessa, thank goodness, was really intent on making sure that a Native American voice was represented in this volume. So Rocky Robbins has written a beautiful piece about the psychoanalytic tradition, and combining that with interventions that are true to Native American culture. So it's, I think, a very rich book, whether you are a clinician or a consultant or a community activist, that you will find ways of thinking about and using ideas about power to really reconstruct your practice. I think I'll stop there.
You know, I have to say, that's great. You know, it's interesting, when you did that, it was like how you helped us this whole process. Pat came in, Elaine and I have been having conversations for how long? 10 years?
Something like that.
And Pat came in with a kind of clarity and skill to help us get structure. This would not have happened without you. It's that really that ability to take some ideas and help shape it. And I think that's why having the conversation and negotiating power, that you come into something 7 years into a process and able to come in and join us like that and to help guide us. It's been really crucial. So I was just sitting there being in awe of your summary. So, conversation. Is there anything else about the process? What things we learned that we would want to share, aside from like, really it's a hard thing to do?
Don't do it when you're 80 or 90.
Well, you know, Elaine has often mentioned when we're working together her thoughts about a power shift that took place during this process, and I think she could talk more about that. Let me just say that from my perspective, our work together was really an embodiment of the concepts of power with, power sharing. I hope and think that we epitomized in working together on this volume exactly what we're looking to help communities and social work schools in particular to begin to think about and to embody. Now, how do you work together for a larger good in a way in which you are not battling about the unimportant issues, but really focusing on the work?
Well, the book was my vision, and I struggled with that conceptual chapter, the first chapter. That was when my brain was beginning to become an old brain, and it was the most difficult, really. The crucible of my life was writing that chapter on a conceptualization of power in human functioning. Never have I had such a difficult time. But being my vision, and I'm in my 80s into my 90s, and my brain is changing, this is when the power shift came, a real power shift. If not for these ladies, the book would never have been completed.
You know, can I ask you a couple questions about the power shift, though? Because we sort of have a passing conversation on the porch about that, and I remember saying, I hope it felt like a power shift or transfer and not a grab in any way.
No way.
I
I was giving it up.
And we were taking it on.
And you were taking it on.
And I think that wasn't, and I think it really was. I mean, when I say a love fest, I know I have friends who've done book collaborations with other people. I've done my own collaborations. And, you know, it didn't end in a restraining order, but there were moments where it could have come close to that. And it really is nice that there has just been a connection, a deepening, and I think that's about the relationship. I think the BICAP chapter in the book is really an important chapter, and I think about showing people the struggle. I think what happens when we start talking about power.
What BICAP is.
Okay, you got, now thank you, you're in it, explain what BICAP, I mean, I just, my brain stopped for just a second, but it's a collaboration. Hugo is part of that group, and it's not only a group, and Pat will tell you more about it, but the chapter was crucial for me because they showed us a window into struggle. When very loving, skilled, super busy people come together to talk about race and justice and power, and then show you that it's not always elegant, that there are struggles, that there are disappointments, and I think that was a really important, because I think people want it to be clean, you want it to be 12 sessions or whatever of structure, and you come out with a certificate, and power is messy, it is confusing, and it is painful. And sometimes you always run up to that edge of wondering if we're jeopardizing relationships. But if you're not willing to do that, and I think BICAP really showed us and let us in to show that struggle, that's why so often I think we don't go where we need to go with power discussions, because we're afraid of we can't come back, we can't make mistakes, we have to tiptoe around things, and so.
Hugo, what is the name of, what does BICAP stand for?
The Boston Institute for Culturally Affirming Practices.
Boston Institute for Culturally Affirming Practice, and it was a group of multicultural practitioners who had worked together for a number of years, I think starting in the 90s. And they had, of course, had many interactions of all kinds, that involve power. So when they set out to write their book, to write their chapter for the book, it constitutes an amazing addition, I feel. And you were a part of it.
Yeah, I would just add that the BICAP chapter attempts to look at the examination of power between colleagues and to think and write about how that impacts the clinical and consulting work that we do. And that, for anyone who has been trained clinically, I think is a very important examination, right? The self-examination. And Hugo writes in that chapter that real power honors the sacred within us. And that's something that we try to speak about and write about in this chapter. The other thing I wanted to add, if I may, is, we're talking about that power shift and Elaine's comments that, thanking us for joining her in this work. There's that saying that we all know, that we stand on the shoulder of giants, and it goes without saying that Elaine is one of those giants in the field of social work. And I think our task as younger people coming along is to continue that work. My clinical work is solely focused now on working with elders. And I see my task in the clinical work with them is to honor the sacred within them, but also to make sure that their voices, their contributions, their legacies are made known to the world, because we have so much to gain and so much to lose if we don't continue to build on the wisdom of those who walk before us.
As an elder, I say amen to that.
And we actually have a chapter for that as well. In terms of Cash and Carrie and Kevin's chapter, which was also a delight to read. I think the other part of this was how much I grew and how much hearing other people's work, and because I'm not in an academic setting, I don't have as much sort of exchange in the way that you had. And so there was the other way about sort of hearing about new work and building on new work. And I think what I always, when I go and talk, is that really, I don't know how many students are in the room. Are there students in the room? Okay, great. Students in the room. First of all, get to know your classmates. I ended up going to Guam because I kept relationships going. Just want to say that, in which they did a 3-day training. Their Department of Behavioral Health did a 3-day training on power as a trauma-informed care intervention. Understanding power as a grounding in trauma-informed care. So one is keep in touch with folks. It can serve you well. But also it helps you build on things. And so for the other thing is about being able to know that you have something to offer right now. You don't have to wait. And we have, in fact, a responsibility. I think that, and for the professors in the room, and I know if this is not talking about you, then let it go, is don't cub kill. And what I mean by that is if you have somebody, I was so nurtured and supported by my professors, Jack Kirkland, Elaine, Leon Chastain, other people, that it was so crucial to have people who, when I didn't know what I was saying was important, that they stopped me and said, that's important, go deeper. And so I really think that that's a whole other piece about when people can be secure enough in their own power that they invite the power in other people. And if you're not doing it, stop that, do it and start and really begin to create some space, because we cannot afford. One of the things I would also say is Black Lives Matter and taking leadership from young people, that movement has galvanized me. It has made me stop and think about what I do and how I do. It's re-energized my own activism and doing it from the place where I live, but it's all about power. And so it's right in front of us. So if we're not teaching it and talking about it in our work, we are missing the opportunity of a lifetime. And I think it's really important is that our activism, and I think in the chapter, the activism of the other writers really, even when it's not explicitly stated, shows through in why and how we do our work. And I think it took a while for me to realize, Pat, wait, what's the rest of your story? I kept hearing things that made me think she's got a deeper story around her activism, and I think that that was really a great part to understand as well. So, is it?
I could not have conceived that the book would be as rich as it is becoming. It has been an amazing adventure. Now, we have someone who's to comment too.
Wait, wait,
I'm talking about,
wait.
oh, you're going to, okay.
Sure. Yeah, we're ready. Yeah, is this a good place to stop? Come on, it's a conversation.
We're going to take some questions, but I just want to mention a couple of things. One is we've been talking about Elaine being a true giant in this field. I want to mention that the book that they've been describing is published by NASW Press. The head of NASW is our own graduate, Angela McClain, right there, stand up, and was one of the
And my doctoral student,
her doctoral student. He's now head of NASW. We're so proud of him, and also proud that NASW Press is going to be publishing this amazing book. So again, thank you, and thanks for being here, Angela. We'll take a couple of questions now before we hear from our respondent. Any questions? Comments?
Quiet room.
Comments?
Quiet room of social workers, for real?
Right. Take the power. Yes, of course.
Thank you. What an amazing works that you all have gathered and garnered and brought power into a space in which others could draw on. So my question would be, Vanessa and I talk about it all the time, and how does, for all three of you, whoever would like to answer, how does the profession of social work begin to reclaim power, and power in terms of courage around activism, power in terms of transformation of others' lives? Because I sense that we've become a bit lost or scattered in our tracks. So if you all could talk a little bit about social work in particular, and how do we begin to stand back in our power for who we are, who we represent, with great courage. I'm not trying to create conflict either.
Oh, you know I love that stuff. Oh, okay. And Pat's going to be quiet. Even you're an honorary social worker, Dave, so you could. I mean, I think for me is that we don't. This is a time when we cannot afford to be cowardly as social workers. I'm just going to say it like straight up like that. I think the history of our profession, so which one of my early jobs out of graduate school was working in what had formerly been a settlement house program in St. Louis. And because I am from the St. Louis region, Ferguson, literally WashU is in the shadow of Ferguson. I think we need to be careful about how much time we spend building buildings and planting flowers. I know it's near graduation time, and so we're going to start the ripping up of the soil and that kind of stuff. Is that we have to make sure that we're putting our resources where they're needed. We need to be in community and of community. I think that if we're not engaging this movement and bringing those movement leaders into our courses, we are missing the opportunity of a lifetime. It should be written up. I mean, it was so great to see Alicia Garza at the State of the Union address with Barbara Lee, because I think it's like really talking about the activism that's going on right now. And it cannot be that you're just reading about it. We need to be up in it. One of the people that I adore, that's why I love that you talked about being arrested. And I had lunch with Dawn Belkin Martinez, who is always getting sort of on the front lines of activism and doing some wonderful things. And we have to be willing to go there. We have to be willing to talk about things. One of the things that was important for me was doing the psychiatric history. I had a graduate degree, and I ended up going in and doing this research and realized how little I knew about the history of social work, but more importantly, the history of mental health in America and its roots in oppression and the way we replay that. So if we don't understand the history, we're going to keep replicating the problems. So we need to be both historical and very, very current.
In answer to Lonnie's question, I think social work should be preparing people to work with Congress. That's where policy is made in this country. So there should be a track in the schools of social work to prepare students for such a role. We had more social workers in Congress, we'd have less Republican-Democrat fights, I think.
I would add a piece. For a couple of years, I taught at a school for social work. And one of the things that I noticed, and it doesn't only happen in social work schools, but that was my experience, was how often young white students would talk about their privilege. And I'm thinking now about a particular student who went on at great length in my class on racism about her privilege. And it was very interesting to me that she was a student who had gone to a college that I was not familiar with, who wrote all right, but not rather well, right? And who, in many ways, was outshone or outshined by other people of color in her classroom. So there's something about the way that we need to reconsider about how we talk about and teach about privilege versus oppression. I'll tell you a story from when I taught at Hampshire College. I inaugurated a course called The Psychology of Oppression, about which I was very proud, and it went well. But several years later, I began to teach a course, co-teach a course with a literature professor called the autobiography, Black autobiography, or African American autobiography. And in that class, I had more students of color than I had in my Psychology of Oppression class, because they wanted to hear and know the narratives of strength and the history of African American contributions in this country. And I had white students saying, oh, I never knew. I never knew that there were people who went to college. I never knew there were black colleges. I never knew there were black doctors and lawyers. So we have to continue to talk about racism, but we also have to change our narrative so that we remind people of the talent, the gifts, the strength, the power that people of color have exercised in this country over centuries. And never, never, never allow ourselves to think about our communities or any of us as powerless. It's all about how we can maximize the power that we have.
Pat, I have a saying, and I want you to tell me if this is accurate. I have often said that privilege doesn't know, and it doesn't know that it doesn't know.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Giving some of the Black history that's a positive, that maybe might be suggested as part of a curriculum for adding to whatever academia you have. It is slanted a little bit, but I mean, it does take some history that maybe some of us who are not workers or people of color would not know all that.
Black history is replete with revolution, with fighting back, with struggles against that we don't know about.
And victory's over.
And that's a perfect transition to the respondent today. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Martin Summers, who's an associate professor of history and African diaspora studies here at Boston College. He regularly teaches courses on gender and sexuality and African American history, Health and Disease in the African Diaspora, and the History of Masculinity in the United States. He's currently director of the African Diaspora Studies Program. He's published numerous articles. He has written a monograph called Manliness and Its Discontents, the Black Middle Class and the Transformation of Masculinity, which was awarded the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch Book Award in 2005. He has done amazing research, and we're delighted to have him be the respondent for this excellent presentation. Martin, can we ask you to come forward?
It's been a real honor to have listened to this wonderful conversation the last 45 minutes or so. Conversation I think is desperately needed across campus, not just within the School of Social Work. I think as an institution we're not doing a good enough job teaching our students about power and intersectionality, our undergraduate students anyway. And so it's just really been humbling to have been here, and I want to thank Dean Godenzi and Professor McCoy for inviting me to participate and serve as a respondent. I should say at the outset, I'm not a social worker, nor do I have any experience in social work education, but I am a historian who has recently taken on a project looking at race and mental illness in the 19th and 20th century US. So I'm very much interested in the role that ideas about racial difference and power play in the clinical encounter. But what can a historian say about the challenge of integrating power analysis in to social work, and education, and practice? Interestingly enough, it's within the past 10 years or so, there's been an increase in scholarship that situates race at the center of its examination of the history of American psychiatry. And I'm largely going to be basing my remarks on a reading of Professor Pinderhughes' Understanding Race, Ethnicity, and Power, and then also the chapter on conceptualization of power. But I'm also going to be talking about it from a historical and a historiographical vantage point. So as I said, within the past 6 years or so, there's been an increase in scholarship that situates race at the center of its examination of the history of American psychiatry. Until very recently, a few of the works that had dealt with the presence of African Americans in mental institutions actually used race as a category of analysis. Instead, what they merely did was to document the discriminatory treatment that African Americans were subjected to within mental institutions. In other words, they largely assume, these scholars largely assume, that race relations within the asylum merely mirrored the relationships between blacks and whites that existed in the larger culture. While this was certainly the case in many respects, more recent work has begun to explore the ways in which ideas of racial difference were embedded in the very discourses of mental health and mental illness that were produced and circulated by psychiatrists, and the subsequent materialization of those discourses into therapeutic practice and patient management strategies. And what this work, including my own, has been doing is to explore the historical processes whereby the normative subject of psychiatric intervention has been racialized as a white subject. And that was something that was really not contemplated by earlier historians of psychiatry in the US. Now, power and authority, both medical and cultural authority, are inherent in the production of a normative subject who shares the same racial identity and perhaps class position as the psychiatrist. Whether it was reflected in the mid-19th century medical consensus that held that African-descended people were immune to insanity because of an underdeveloped nervous system, or the early 20th century belief that their natural duplicity made African Americans unlikely candidates for effective psychoanalytic treatment, or the post-war tendency to overdiagnose mentally ill blacks as schizophrenics who were prone to violence, the wielders of what constituted psychiatric knowledge have historically cordoned off an entire segment of the human family as fundamentally psychically different. In doing so, they posited the white psyche as the norm, paid closer attention to what they assumed caused mental stress in white people, and devoted more resources to repairing psychologically damaged whites and reforming white social deviants. Now, one could, of course, apply this dynamic of the naturalization of whiteness to other arenas of medical care and social welfare. And in fact, Professor Pinderhughes does just this in her book, Understanding Race, Ethnicity, and Power, in which she writes, quote, "In the fields of health, mental health, and social services, the needs and problems identified as significant to white middle-class persons were assumed to be the appropriate yardsticks for understanding and delivering services to everyone," end quote. Now, this dimension of power, the power to define the meaning and boundaries of the normative, has been present in social work and other forms of social service since the beginning. And historians of social work have been attentive to this for quite some time. In his book on the professionalization of social work in the 20th century, Daniel Walkowitz points out that, quote, "Most women settlement house workers brought a native-born white perspective to their work, one in which their middle-class identity contrasted the ethnic immigrant identities of the neighbors they served." He goes on to argue more explicitly that during the progressive era, quote, "Formal social work was generally a white person's job, done by white people for white people," end quote. Now, this had become an obvious observation and critique of psychiatry by black psychiatrists in the 1960s and 1970s, but unfortunately, historians of psychiatry have largely forgotten, or rather ignored, this aspect of power until fairly recently. But as Professor Pinderhughes points out in her chapter, Conceptualization of How Power Operates in Human Functioning, and I have to say, you talked about how challenging and difficult it was to write, but it really doesn't appear that way in the draft that I received. It's incredibly fluid analysis of how power functions. And according to Professor Pinderhughes, power is dynamic and multifaceted. It is a, quote, "social relation that can open up or close off opportunities for individuals or groups. It functions at the level of the individual, the interpersonal, the intragroup, and the intergroup. It is authoritative, ascribed good and bad. It can be both oppressive and liberatory. The challenge confronting practitioners is to transform the oppressive nature of power into a cooperative form of power that allows self-determination for the service user. Quote, "Invitations to cooperate and work alongside one another may potentially allow shifts from entrenched identities, such as expert or victim, and start to undermine social constructions of us and them," Professor Pinderhughes writes, "thereby opening up opportunities for all participants to enter into a process of transformation," end quote. Now, although between the book, Understanding Race, Ethnicity, and Power, and the chapter on conceptualization of how power operates, the term only occurs once. As I read these works, I kept thinking about the concept of cultural competency, the importance of the healthcare practitioner or social worker being attentive to all of the cultural variables that condition the ways that individuals in medical or social crises present, develop coping mechanisms, and respond to treatment or other interventions is essential to developing a clinical relationship that is free of bias, condescension, apathy, and so forth. As Professor Pinderhughes wrote in 1989, the ability to become comfortable with culturally different others and to recognize the relativity of one's own values are critical elements in professional training, but are extremely difficult to develop. The development of cultural sensitivity requires first an awareness and understanding of one's own cultural background and its meaning and significance for one's own interactions with others. Now, interestingly enough, historians of psychiatry who have recently begun employing race as a category of analysis have also been critical of cultural competency, and this may very well be the case with social work researchers and educators as well, that cultural competency has already come up for critique and it's evidence of a chasm that exists between the kinds of conversations that historians are having and the kinds of conversations that social work researchers are having. And this very may well be an occasion of historians arriving to the dinner party late, only to have the bones of a desiccated concept to pick over. Now, some of the critiques of cultural competency are that it presumes that cultures are fixed and ethno-racial groups are monolithic, that it presumes that the social service provider can acquire competent mastery over the beliefs, family structures, practices, or attitudes of another person, and that it presumes that the cultural competency flows in only one direction, obviating the need for the practitioner to scrutinize his or her own cultural background, a necessary condition for effective cross-cultural practice that Professor Pinderhughes pointed out in 1989. In short, many critics argue that cultural competency does little to dislodge the white subject as the norm, either as a physician, psychiatrist, nurse, social worker, or the patient, client, a social service user. In my own work, which looks at the relationship between a federal mental institution in Washington, D.C., St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and the African American community in the district, I've encountered St. Elizabeth's psychiatrists stressing the importance of taking into consideration the racial background of their black patients when establishing therapeutic relationships with them. In a 1914 article about schizophrenia among African Americans, Dr. Ara Everts made an interesting statement about the importance of race in the clinical encounter. Quote, "The race sense, S-E-N-S-E, if so we may call it, is so integral a part of the psychiatrist himself that often he sees without seeing and understands without understanding when his patients are those of his own race. When, however, he is dealing with those of another race, this conformity of experience is lacking and must be consciously made a factor in the equation before its final solution will be satisfactory." Now, while in some ways this reads as a forerunner to the late 20th century discourse of cultural competency, Everett's exhortation to St. Elizabeth's psychiatrists to become hyper-conscious of the history and culture of African Americans ended up, ironically, reinforcing the very conceptions of racial difference with which they entered the clinical encounter in the first place. Being attentive to the race sense of African Americans, in other words, naturalized their difference and only further othered them. Now, just as cultural competency fails to dislodge the white subject as the norm, other historians, including Gabriel Marquez, argues that its emphasis on the patient's culture and the clinician's capacity to read and accommodate that patient's difference tends to elide the larger structures of inequity that perpetuate not race, but racism. This critique of cultural competency has animated calls for its replacement, or at least augmentation, with structural competency, an approach to the clinical encounter that stresses comprehension of the complex relationships between clinical symptoms and social, political, and economic systems. Structural competency requires coming to terms with the ways that health disparities and the different capacities for marginalized people to respond to the efforts of healthcare practitioners and other social service providers are shaped by income inequality, infrastructural underdevelopment, government neglect, political disempowerment, and other social barriers. So here, Professor Pinderhughes' work is especially relevant as she reminds us that, quote, "power operates across levels from the personal/individual to the institutional/structural. Oppressive power places constraints on people's ability to set their own agenda in the clinical setting. Some of these constraints are systemic, including laws, customs, values, belief systems, and institutions. And although she acknowledged that the model that she developed in 1989 was limited to, quote, the examination of experiences within the family, workplace, and community, she also points to the importance of the UK model in that it it includes structures and systems, and this is in her the most recent chapter, This UK model includes structures and systems that allow practitioners to develop an analysis of how power, quote, extends from individual, family, and community levels to national, regional, and even global levels, end quote. Now, those advocating for a structural competency model of training operate on the same premise of the continuum between the individual and interpersonal on the one hand, and the macro political, economic, and social on the other. And here is where I think and hope that historians and clinical practitioners can engage one another. To the extent that power is a social relation, it is a historical one as well. And moreover, the cultural differences and structural realities over which practitioners should develop competence do not exist outside of history. To that end, historians can provide insight into the kinds of barriers that might exist between practitioners and clients and the kinds of systemic challenges that include the patient's behaviors in the therapeutic relationship. And so this speaks to your comment about the importance of social workers being both historical and current. But I would also flip that around and say that historians need to also be historical and current. Historians, and particularly historians of medicine and psychiatry, can learn a great deal from those who do the actual work of tending to the physical, psychological, and social needs of those who are in distress, and from those who are educators and researchers in the field. This is clearly the case when we consider how behind the curve historians of medicine and psychiatry have been when it comes to thinking about the role that race has played in the construction of the normative subject in the world of healthcare. It remains to be seen what else we can learn from our colleagues who undertake clinical research and practice, and the possibilities are legion. For me, I've only begun to scratch the surface, and I thank you for the opportunity that has allowed me to do this. Thanks.
Summers, that I'm not responding directly to your most recent presentation, but going back to what you were talking about, maybe you'll say, wait for the book, read the book, but I was hoping that you might tell us a little bit more about that relationship between power and touching the divine in the other. Or I may be misquoting, but I was really intrigued to hear that phrase and would love to hear a little bit more.
I want to first offer the opportunity to Hugo to say a little bit more about that, because that was a phrase taken from the BICAP chapter, and that's actually Hugo Camya's phrase. So would you like to speak to that at all, Hugo? I don't want to put you on the spot. So yeah, I'm happy to speak to it. So.
Wow. Real power honors the sacred in us. I think what I might just say, being put on the spot right now, it's quite a while since we wrote this, is that maybe there is the sense of recognition of the good in you and the good in me, and perhaps getting back to what Professor Summers was talking about, the whole issue of what Elaine talks about, the us and them, the othering piece, is that if we pay attention to the good in each other, the good that we share, and the importance of highlighting that for ourselves as well as for those we encounter, it sort of allows us to seek what is most divine in others, what's most divine in us, and it is really honoring the divine that surrounds us. That's all I can say.
I'm going to put you on the spot, not put you on the spot to say anything, but also to just acknowledge the whole sacred part. I was really struggling at one point when I was thinking about what I thought was the process. I was analyzing my practice and thinking about like what helped people to change when they were trapped in what I call power wound. I stopped using the term trauma because it felt too fixed and limited and overplayed, but also in my conversations with my own clients, we began to describe it as a power wound. And as part of that, I kept thinking about the process of people naming it, having it witnessed, and other things. I thought, but where's the point of change? And I remember it was hope. And so it occurred to me that hope is really central to people making a shift, for communities making a shift around being wounded in their power. And I had a conversation in the lobby in Atlanta with Hugo, I said, I'm not finding much written about hope. It's sort of like empowerment and power, that hope is really such a big piece of our work, and I don't remember being trained in hope. And one of the things that you said to me then is that hope sits so close to faith that oftentimes as social workers we're afraid to go there. And yet we leave something outside of the consulting room, we leave something outside of our community work. Not that everyone has the same spiritual traditions, but to leave that sacredness and as such a powerful transformative experience, it just didn't make sense. But I really thank you for helping me to understand my own sort of discomfort. It's like the boundaries don't talk about these things, and yet when we're talking about profound wounding individually or in communities, we've got to talk about the thing that sustains people. And I start talking about as a power spark, that I listen to people and they tell me things like, how did you hold a sense of yourself in this moment? And everybody could find these things that happened. And so we just started calling them power sparks that let people have a foothold to change. And so I think that bringing the sacred into our work is, for me, essential. And I'd also say in the course of our working together, I was doing some spiritual exploration that really changed my work. And really, it changed the nature of my work and made me a little more fearless around inviting people to bring whatever sustains them into the room, that there is a piece of magic, I think, that makes our stuff work.
Yeah,
Usually
yeah.
don't take the microphone, but I just want to respond to Dr. Summers. Not only did you set a whole new standard of what a respondent is, I will turn down every request for me being a respondent after I heard you talk today. That was really dramatic. I also thought that your conceptualization of structural competence is extremely important for us, and includes what the three authors here have talked about, power, and I would love to invite you to a social work conference and make that case, because it's almost like a holy concept, cultural competence, and to really think about this, at least combining it with the structural competence understanding would be really crucial. And the last comment I want to make is that your historical work on mental health, just this morning I was listening to NPR, and the WHO representative was talking about WHO taking care of, or thinking about that countries need to take care a lot more of mental health issues because it would save them a lot of money. And the interesting thing was they measured mental health services only by how many psychiatrists are in a country serving mental health patients. Not one word about social workers or other mental health counselors. It was just measured, this typical medical model that is always there, and I think making that more aware people would really help tremendously. But thank you so much for that amazing contribution.
Thank you. And I'll just quickly say, I just recently came into contact with this literature on structural competency, and I don't even know that there's much. My entree into it is reading the work of Jonathan Metzl, who in 2010 wrote a book called The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. He's a psychiatrist and an American Studies scholar, and he's the director of the Center for Health, Medicine, and Society at Vanderbilt. And he and a colleague, who I believe is a clinical psychologist, published a piece on structural competency in social science and medicine that just came out about 2 years ago.
Great resource. Elaine?
Did I hear you say something about slavery becoming more treated in history these days? Was that something I heard?
Oh, no, not, well, slavery's been, subject of historical examination forever. No, it's that within the field of history of psychiatry and history of mental illness, race is only now being studied seriously, again, as a category of analysis. So I'm really interested in talking to you about the work that you're doing too.
Because that was the one thing, because I think that therein lies the problem, because if you're talking about the history of psychiatry, then you miss all this other stuff. And especially my research on African American psychiatry was from a consumer survivor ex-patient perspective. And And I think the best thing, I mean, what transformed my work was talking to people with the lived experience, talking to people who've been incarcerated in these hospitals about, so it's interesting, like everything old is new again. When I hear people talk about peer supports and that stuff, it's super, super important. But it's like it's been happening since the day the first asylum opened, because they were basically run by the patients. And I think so being in some of those, in those places and seeing, especially a place that stands out for me is Lincoln State Hospital, which is both a tribute to Black excellence in West Virginia, this tiny little place which had the best trained staff in the country, literally the best trained staff in the country.
Yeah, the first Black superintendent
Yes.
at St. Elizabeth's, Luther Robinson, got his start at Lincoln.
Right, and literally, when I saw a picture of their staff, it was like a family portrait. There's even a child in the portrait. And I remember being in the State Archives building and literally screaming because I had missed that it had a Black superintendent from the very beginning. So I think that for me, and the social worker in that program, I mean, it was just amazing about our excellence and what we know. And it isn't that it's not out there, it's that people have to care enough to look. We have always been here. We have not always been the recipients of service, and I think, again, that's what you helped me understand. If I don't claim my power as someone that offers knowledge, then it could get really distorted about our ability to provide care and to listen to the stories, especially of people with a lived experience. And the other cool thing when you're talking about St. Elizabeth's is the Native American history when they closed the Hiawatha Insane Asylum, which was one of the most awful places in the world, is they shipped them to St. Elizabeth's. And so there's all this, our entangled history. I think that's the other part, is our entangled history. Oh, Kevin.
Okay. Kevin?
Well, first off, I can't wait to read the whole book. As you've talked about each chapter, it's pretty exciting. Lately, I've been thinking about powerlessness and its relationship to kinds of power, and I just like to a personal reflection and get your thoughts. You know, like lately, I have two sons with disabilities, and you go through things where lost jobs, maybe addictions, maybe businesses that have processes that won't change, and you feel, and I was reviewing an article, and it was asking about, has your life ever felt like you're not in control? This was and then I started laughing, which is probably a kind of power. But where I'm sort of going with this is I've noticed with cash and counseling a pattern of where the people with the greatest level of disability are the ones who want the chance more often to direct their own services. Or I find for myself I'm praying the alcoholic's prayer, but thinking of each part of it as power. I mean, because the wisdom, the ability to know the things I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference seems as important as the courage to change the things I can. So it's just a reflection on the other side and what you think.
I think your chapter, Kevin, illustrates on multi-levels the empowerment of people. And it's a real illustration of how important it is to understand power and to help people to be able to take care of themselves. It's how much you've gotten much government funding for this project. Maybe you should speak about it.
One form of power.
I'm not talking about money and power.
I think we've got time for about one more question right here. Yes.
The empowering aspect of the work he does for people. People are given the money to choose the services that they want to have. Is that not right? And you've received a lot of government funding now to put this in operation across the country.
Yes.
Yes, I'm looking forward to reading this book. And one of the reasons that I came was because you were talking about power. And I was thinking during the panel, it's like the P word. You know, people do not want to talk about power, whether it's in social work or anywhere else. It's considered very threatening. And I think unless people in social work, I'm one of the people that was trained at University of Connecticut School of Social Work, and we did go through power analysis, and I did community organizing as my major. So with the activism right now, I think the whole idea of speaking up to power, which you were talking about in terms, Vanessa, in terms of activism, is so critical and so important. But social work as a profession has never really grappled with that, I don't think. I think speaking up to power is so important, and confronting it. And like we don't talk about class, we don't talk about power. And I think it's a really major flaw, and why I never considered myself the, quote, traditional social worker. Felt like I was more alternative in my choices. So I just wonder about what you think of this, as why it's so avoided. And obviously the reasons have to do with people don't like people who confront power, but social workers really should be confronting power, because that's the only way to really create any change.
Social workers have a lot of power in the work they do. They have the power to take children from families. They have enormous power, and they need to respect it.
But I think also this goes back to powerlessness and the sense of like, I remember you know, sometimes you have books that you keep on your shelves that you buy, and somehow your spirit knows you're not yet ready to deal with it. And Michael Lerner's Surplus Powerlessness was a book I had on my shelf for years. And I think that's a huge part of the problem. It's like, it's one thing to not have power. It's a whole other thing to have power and act as if you don't or be afraid to use it. And Lonnie periodically would bring me into her classes where it's my personal goal to start near riots. And the last near riot, and I hope that there's letters pouring in at some point to CSWE, because one of the things people are talking about is what I've referred to as the indentured servitude, the 3 years that's required postgraduate for people to get licensure. And I was starting to hear little sprinkles of people of all this anxiety, because when I was coming out of school, that I could, in my first jobs, have my supervision, I could get a salary and get supervision, and more, that is not the case. And so we have people who are being horrendously exploited by other mental health professionals and organizations, paying for their own supervision. You're not going to get wildly radical people when they're so worried about paying back $100,000 in loans. Top number I heard was $249,000. I will not even tell you my response to that person. They told me that. I said, but you need to either just move on with your life, because that's not going to happen. But we have people racking up all this debt. That immediately makes people fearful. We know that as social workers, being an indenture, there's owing so much money, being a wage slave makes people fearful. So we're not going to have social workers taking big stands. We're protecting, we have to watch, we engage in guild protection, because we're trying to survive. And for me, the historical context is that I always tell people that psychiatry in the early 1900s, psychiatry and social work had a fight, and psychiatry won. And it's been a mess ever since. We understood the social, and so people are now talking about social determinants of health. And it's like, thank you for discovering social work. We really appreciate that. So we have to really do a better job with our brand and our history and reclaiming it. But some of our own powerlessness, because we feel like second-class citizens in the mental health realm, doesn't have us standing up and advocating in the ways that we need to.
You have clearly given us a challenge, and I'm going to have to use some power at this point because of our time frame here. You had one comment? Okay.
talk about speaking up to power. I don't know how many people watched the Jackie Robinson series the last 2 nights, but the issue of speaking up and how do you speak up without being put down? You're an uppity nigger is what came out when he started to speak up after turning the other cheek for 2 years. The same thing happens with women politicians. So if Hillary speaks up, she's being shrill, aggressive, and so forth. Would you like to talk about what strategies you have on how to speak up to power so that you can make something happen?
We have time for maybe one comment.
I think number one, it depends on your goals. I mean, what you want, where you want to go, it will determine when you speak up and how you speak up. That's the decision you have to make. But once you've made that decision, then you have to be wise in how you do it in terms of your goals.
I just want to quickly add, in my chapter, I write about a group of workers who came together to oust their director in the social service program. And one of the ways that you do that is you work with others, right? That you take your power and you link it to other people who have knowledge and power, and you keep, sustaining the effort.
Isn't that
Well-
example in the book?
Yeah.
It's in the book. Well said. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Give my- This has been amazing, and I know that we're going to have everybody in this room purchasing the book. Before we go, we have just 2 more things we need to do. One, we want to acknowledge the recipient of the Pinderhughes Scholarship. I'd like for Marcy to come forward to make that announcement. Marcy Pitt-Katsufas, who runs our doctoral program, will announce the recipient of this year's Pinderhughes Scholarship.
Boy, thank you all so very much. What a wonderful morning. I know we're all going to take treasures of insight and wisdom with us as we leave today. Clearly, today's 10th anniversary is a celebration of the legacy that Elaine has been building for many years, both through her teaching, directly touching many of us, as well as people who benefited from her insight through her scholarship and writing. Some of you may know that Elaine and her family and their generosity has also provided us with another generative legacy, and that they have supported the Pinderhughes Fellowship, which supports a doctoral student to further the research of an African-American doctoral student. And this year I am thrilled to announce that we will be providing this next year to Victor Figueiredo. I can only tell you a couple quick things about him, and I'll ask him to stand so we can acknowledge this wonderful accomplishment of his. As is the case for several of our doctoral students, he's a McNair Scholar, which means he was identified very early on in his undergraduate work as a rising star. He has already engaged in research in a range of topics, including microaggression. Under the wonderful mentorship of Dr. Rocío Calvo, he has already started to co-author manuscripts and has co-presented at a number of academic conferences. So not only do I want to acknowledge this, but with our applause, Victor, if you could stand up, we want to wish you well in your future accomplishments. Thank you.
My understanding, there's something below here.
It's not locked, is it?
Oops. Getting it out. Well, Elaine, it has been, as I always said, one of my great privileges to have you, not as a full-time faculty, but as a consigliera a consultant telling me when I was going the wrong way, go over here. And she has done that in a very polite way. If you want to know how to influence power, she can tell you how to influence power. She is really unbelievably subtle, but very consistent. And I just had the privilege of having this opportunity. And I hope and I trust that the school will continue having this diversity and justice lecturer in your honor. And I think it will influence and inform many, many generations to come. I want to thank the panelists, our respondent. It was a really remarkable and historic event. So for you, flowers and a little gift.